Okay, we apologize. We had some little technical problems that knocked us off of the air for a bit. And so now everything is rebooted and we're back on the air again. And so we're picking up where I was going when we went off the air for just a bit. The necessity, and we were talking about on the subject of baptism and how that they were baptizing each other in order to make it scriptural. Yeah, right. Okay. So the necessity for this procedure lay in the fact that, quote, that there was no church to whom we could join with a good conscience to have baptism from them, unquote. They didn't have it. Smith and I cannot find anywhere in Newman's writings where the fact that scriptural baptism must come through a local church was ever introduced. There never seems to arise in the matter of scriptural baptism. Smith and his followers were soon excluded from the church that Smith started because of false teachings to which he adhered. From the exclusion of Smith and his adherents onward, Helwys and Merton were the leaders of what afterward came to be known as General Baptists. Yes, sir. Okay. So he is the same Smith that we find in America later on. Okay. He wasn't a Baptist to begin with. All right, Smith continued till his death to antagonize pedobaptism. And a few... There's that word.
Meaning baptism of
right. Pedobaptism. And few have ever presented the Baptist argument in a more convincing manner. Smith claimed that the English separatists had placed themselves in a position that they could not consistently hold. They had renounced the Church of England as apostate, yet had been content with the baptism and the ordinance that they had received. Ordination that they had received in connection with that body. They claimed to be striving to set up churches of the regenerate, but continued to baptize infants, excuse me, and without claiming that they were regenerated thereby, to give them a quasi-membership in their churches. Excuse me. Some of the opponents of Smith are apparently under the influence of his arguments abandoned the extreme separatist position in favor of what is known as semi-separatism. There arose two different groups in England that were called Baptists. The appellative peculiar, particular, thank you, particular, yes. The word appellative is relating to or denoting of giving of a name. in the particular Calvinistic doctrine of redemption limited to the elect. So the appellative particular as applied to Baptists has reference to their doctrine of redemption as limited to the elect, in contradistinction to the doctrine of universal redemption from which the general Baptists derived their designation. Does that make a lot of sense? The rise of the particular Baptist was as follows. In 1616, Henry Jacob, an Oxford graduate who had been converted to congregational views by Francis Johnson, and who had been for some years pastor of an English congregation at Middelburg, Zeeland. That must be in Holland somewhere. Returned to England with a number of his church members and settled at Southwark, London. He doubtless soon gathered into his congregation the scattered members of earlier churches, so far as these had survived and remained in the vicinity. Jacob's church was to be the mother of the English independence. And of the particular Baptist as well. Excuse me. All right. Discouraged by the threatening aspect of ecclesiastical affairs, Jacob immigrated to Virginia in 1624. In other words, he said, I am not going to lose my life. I'm out of here. He was succeeded in the pastorate by John Lathrop, a Cambridge graduate. Pastor and people suffered almost constant persecution under Archbishop Laud. In 1632, 40 of the members, including the pastor, were thrown into prison. Lathrop was released in 1634, just 2 years later, but felt obligated to immigrate to New England. So a lot of these fellows were escaping to New England, but when they get over there, they're not doing anything. During Lathrop's pastorate, a number withdrew, quote, because the congregation kept not to their first principles of separation, and because they were convinced that baptism was not to be administered to infants, but only to such as professed faith in Christ. According to an account attributed to William Kiffin, a prominent actor in the later succession, and afterward one of the most influential of the particular Baptist leaders, quote, the church, considering that they were now grown very numerous and so more than could in these times of persecution, conveniently meet together, and believing also that those persons acted from a principle of conscience and not obstinacy, agreed to allow them the liberty they desired, and that they should be constituted a distinct church, which they performed the 12th of September, 1633. As they believed that baptism was not rightly administered to infants, so they looked upon baptism they had received in that age as invalid, whereupon most or all of them received a new baptism. Their minister was a Mr. John Spilsbury. According to the record of the original church, in 1638, 7 others whose names are given, quote, desiring to depart and not to be censured, our interest in them was remitted with prayer made in their behalf, they having first forsaken us and joined Mr. Spilsbury. Spilsbury felt no difficulty about the introduction of believers' baptism, maintaining that baptizedness, I think they made that word up, is not essential to the administrator, unquote, and repudiating the demand for apostolic succession as leading logically from the popedom of Rome. Now, what they were talking about here is no one, the common belief was no one could administer baptism except the pastors or spiritual leaders or priests. So they're saying that's not necessary. So here is a little bit of a hint of them referring to church authority in relating to baptism. The Baptist 11 would continue to work in this congregation until the whole Mass should have been leavened. According to the Kiffin manuscript, 1640, 3rd month, the church became 2 by mutual consent, just half being with Mr. P. Barebone and the other half with Mr. H. Jesse. Mr. Richard Blunt with him, being convinced of baptism, that also it ought to be by dipping the body into water, resembling burial and rising again. And they give the passages of Scripture. Had sober conference about it in the church, and then with some of the forenamed, who also were so convinced, and after prayer and conference about their so enjoying it, none having then so practiced in England, to professed believers, and hearing that some in the Netherlands had so practiced, they agreed and sent over Mr. Richard Blunt, who understood Dutch, with letters of commendation, who was kindly accepted there and returned with letters from them. John, I'm not sure where to pronounce these, Bat, a teacher there, and from that church to such as sent him. Now, if I'm understanding this correctly, which I think I am, they felt like that because none had been baptized, immersed, they had to go to somewhere in order for it to get done. So they go to Holland. And so all right, let's go on this and you'll understand it better. All right, that was in 1641. they proceed on their end. Those persons that were persuaded baptism should be by dipping the body had met in two companies and did intend to do so to meet after this. All these agreed to proceed alike together, then manifesting, not by any formal words, a covenant, which word was sculpted by some of them. Scrupled, okay. All right, scrupled. But by mutual desires and agreement, each testified, these two companies did so apart one to baptize the rest, and so it was solemnly performed by them. Mr. Blunt baptized Mr. Blacklock. There was a teacher amongst them. And Mr. Blunt being baptized, he and Mr. Blacklock baptized the rest of their friends that were so minded, and many being added to them, they increased much. I still question the scripturalness of that.
It sounds like that they were concerned about their scriptural baptism, about their baptism being scriptural, so they sent a letter and an emissary to the churches in Holland
Mm-hmm.
to, it almost sounds like request authority from them as a mission or church fellowship or something, and then that church sent back letters and an individual with him.
Correct.
So one went, two came back, and then baptized the rest.
That seems to have been the case,
Almost
yes.
seems like that they, sent, like the church of Antioch sent Paul and Barnabas to Jerusalem with letters, and then and then Jerusalem came back and with fellowship. Or it almost seems like they said, we're not sure about our scriptural baptism or our scriptural authority.
Right.
So they reached out to a church with letters and someone to talk to them, and then come back, okay, yes, we are, by church authority, granting your church authority to baptize, almost like was done in the New Testament.
Right. But given, but given those who are now, in this case, in Holland, are they Mennonites or are they Baptist? That was my question. And it wasn't.
Doesn't say who they reached out to.
No, it doesn't. It said they went to Holland.
Yes.
But in Holland were the Mennonites, but also Baptist.
Right.
So it's a question that I never found the answer. Okay? Now, among those who succeeded with Spilsbury in 1633 and who were immersed in 1641 was Mark Lucar, who was afterward to occupy the position of ruling elder and to be a leading worker in John Clark's church at Newport, Rhode Island, of which he was one of the first founders, and I think Felt is his source Newman's referring to, and who died at Newport at an advanced age in 1676, leaving the character of a very worthy walker.
Brother Joe, I believe that church in Newport was the first Baptist church in America. I believe it was. Is that right?
Yes, sir. We're going to cover that
Yeah,
in the next session.
exactly.
All right, now I have highlighted this because I feel that this was an important connection. This point of connection between the earliest particular Baptist church of England and one of the two earliest American Baptist churches has hitherto, so far as the writer is aware, been overlooked in of considerable importance. In other words, Newman is saying, here is the link, here is the tie between the English Baptists and the Baptist becoming so in America. All right, quickly. Open or closed communion? Here again is a question. Baptism was not the only matter that concerned these predecessors, Predecessors, predecessors of the American churches. Newman writes, it was an almost inevitable consequence of the circumstances under which these churches were formed that open communion should have been to some extent practiced. The separations were from the beginning peaceful, and when the pastor of the original congregation became a Baptist, Pedo-Baptist members remained in the church. Mixed churches involved open communion. William Kiffin became a staunch advocate of restricted communion. Henry, Jesse, John Toombs, John Bunyan, we know that name well, and others advocated and practiced open communion. Restricted communion gained ground during the 18th century, but toward the close of that century and during the present century, that's Newman's century, under the influence of Robert Robinson, Robert Hall, and Charles H. Spurgeon, open communion has become very general among English, but not among Welsh and Scotch Baptists. Yet the number of closed communion churches in England is still considerable, and that was in Newman's day. All right, so conclusion to part one. Thus the foundation is laid for the account of the Baptist in the United States of America. In the next part, we'll consider who became responsible for the organization of Baptists and the introduction of freedom of worship. And we will be looking at two main characters, Roger Williams and John Clark. Any questions, comments? All right.
You've been listening to the live broadcast of the Wednesday evening Bible study of the Mayfield Drive Baptist Church in Smyrna, Tennessee. We invite you to tune in at the same time next Wednesday evening for another live broadcast of the Wednesday evening Bible study. We would love to see your comments regarding this broadcast. You may email us at imbr@imbmpodcast.com. That's imbr@imbmpodcasts.com. Or you may write to us at International Missionary Baptist Radio, P.O. Box 1676,
Smyrna, Tennessee, 37167. That's International Missionary Baptist Radio, P.O. Box 1676, Smyrna, Tennessee, 37167. Thank you for listening, and may you have a blessed day.